They ran into each other at a veterans event where she was volunteering. The moment was awkward but civil. He looked healthy, strong, at peace with himself. His new girlfriend stood supportively by his side, her hand resting naturally on his shoulder. The contrast between this woman's genuine commitment and her own past failures hit hard, but it also showed her how much she'd grown. She could now face the consequences of her actions without running away. Life had a way of coming full circle. The school where she'd once taught now invited her to speak to the staff about recognizing and supporting caregivers' mental health. Standing in that familiar auditorium, she shared her story not to justify her actions, but to help others avoid the same pitfalls. "We often talk about the person receiving care," she said, "but we rarely discuss what happens to the caregiver's soul when they lose themselves in the process." As another year passed, she found her own path forward. She went back to school, studying counseling with a focus on supporting military families. Her past mistakes became the foundation for helping others navigate the complex emotions of caregiving. She would never forget the pain she caused, but she learned to use that memory as a guide for making better choices. Her ex-husband's new life flourished. She heard through friends that he was planning to marry his girlfriend, the woman who had shown him that love could be both strong and gentle, committed and free. The news brought tears, but they weren't bitter anymore. She had finally learned to wish him well without drowning in regret. In the end, their story became more than just a tale of betrayal. It became a lesson about human nature, about the importance of maintaining one's identity while caring for others, about the possibility of finding purpose even in life's darkest moments. She would never be proud of her choices, but she learned to be proud of how she faced their consequences, of how she transformed her guilt into something that could help others avoid the same mistakes. A year had passed since the discovery that shattered their marriage. The seasons had changed, people had moved on, but the weight of regret remained constant in her heart. She'd started seeing a therapist regularly, trying to understand the choices that had led her down such a destructive path. The therapy sessions were brutal at first. Each week, she'd sit in a comfortable office, facing uncomfortable truths about herself. Her therapist didn't offer easy answers or quick forgiveness. Instead, she helped her dig deep into the roots of her decisions, the fear, the overwhelm, the gradual erosion of her identity as she became consumed by her role as a caregiver. "You didn't just betray your husband," her therapist pointed out during one particularly difficult session. "You betrayed yourself, your values, everything you believe you stood for." Those words hit harder than any accusation from the community. They'd forced her to look in the mirror and truly see what she'd become. Meanwhile, her ex-husband's life had taken an unexpected turn towards something remarkable. Through his work with the VA support group, he discovered a talent for helping other injured veterans navigate their new realities. What started as informal mentoring grew into a full-fledged support program. He began speaking at veterans events, sharing his story of both physical and emotional recovery. She heard about his success through mutual friends who still kept in touch. They told her how he'd learned to drive an adapted vehicle, how he'd started a wheelchair basketball league for disabled veterans, how his smile had returned, different from before, but genuine. Each story was a bittersweet reminder of his strength and resilience. The PE teacher had moved to another state, she heard. Sometimes, late at night, she'd wonder if he was doing the same thing to someone else, playing the role of sympathetic friend until it became something more sinister. The thought made her sick to her stomach. She'd written him a letter once, not to reconnect, but to hold him accountable for his part in their betrayal. She never sent it, realizing that her healing couldn't depend on his response. Her own journey toward redemption started small. She volunteered at a local senior center, helping elderly residents with their daily activities. It wasn't the same as her teaching career, but it gave her a sense of purpose. More importantly, it taught her how to care for others without losing herself in the process. The hardest lesson came when she heard her ex-husband had started dating again. The news reached her through the grapevine. He'd met someone at a veterans fundraiser, another teacher who worked with children with disabilities. People said she was kind, patient, and genuinely committed to understanding his world. The jealousy she felt surprised her, not because she wanted him back, but because this woman was everything she should have been. Her therapist helped her process these feelings. "You're not mourning the relationship anymore," she explained. "You're mourning the person you could have been." This realization marked a turning point in her healing. She started journaling, documenting her journey from betrayal to awareness. The words flowed easily, carrying years of guilt, shame, and finally, understanding. She began speaking at support groups for caregivers, not as an expert, but as a cautionary tale. Take care of yourselves, she'd tell them, her voice carrying the weight of experience. Love isn't just about sacrifice, it's about staying true to who you are while supporting someone else. Her honesty touched people, especially those struggling with the same feelings of overwhelm and isolation she'd once faced. The military community's anger toward her slowly shifted to something more complex. While some would never forgive her, others began to see her story as a difficult lesson about human frailty and the importance of maintaining one's own identity while caring for others. One military wife approached her after a support group meeting, saying, "Thank you for being brave enough to share your mistakes. It made me realize I needed help too." Her ex-husband's success continued to grow. He started a non-profit organization helping disabled veterans rebuild their lives through sports and peer support. Local news covered his story, celebrating his resilience and dedication to serving others. When she saw him on TV, speaking confidently from his wheelchair about turning adversity into opportunity, she felt a complex mix of pride and regret. Their story became a cautionary tale in the military community. In support group meetings, wives would reference what happened as a reminder of their vows, in sickness and in health, took on new meaning. The base chaplain even used their story, without names, in his counseling sessions with struggling couples. Her family's disappointment was perhaps the hardest to bear. Her mother, who had always been proud of her daughter's dedication to her injured husband, now couldn't look her in the eye. Her father, a veteran himself, stopped speaking to her entirely. Sunday family dinners, once a source of comfort, became memories she could only revisit in her mind. The worst part wasn't the isolation or the judgment, it was knowing that every consequence was earned. Each cold shoulder, each lost opportunity, each night spent alone in her sister's guest room was the result of her own choices. The community hadn't abandoned her, she had abandoned them first when she chose to betray one of their own. As winter turned to spring, she watched from a distance as her husband's life moved forward without her. The apartment they'd shared was now his sanctuary, a place where he was building a new life brick by brick. Meanwhile, she felt stuck in a purgatory of her own making, haunted by memories of what she'd lost and the knowledge that she had no one to blame but herself. News travels fast in a military community. Within days of the discovery, the whispers began. At the base commissary, conversations would stop when she walked by. Friends who had once welcomed her with open arms now avoided eye contact. The community that had been her support system for years slowly turned its back on her, one person at a time. The PE teacher showed his true colors almost immediately. When word got out about their affair, he requested an immediate transfer to another school district. He blocked her number, deleted all their photos, and pretended they had never met. His final message was brief. "I think it's best if we don't contact each other anymore. I'm sorry, but I need to protect my career." She found herself alone in her sister's guest room, surrounded by hastily packed bags and memories she couldn't escape. Her phone, once constantly buzzing with messages from her lover, now stayed silent except for calls from her lawyer and disappointed family members. The isolation felt like a physical weight on her chest. At the elementary school, the principal called her in for a meeting. Though sympathetic, he explained that given the circumstances and the community's reaction, it would be best if she resigned. Her dream job, the career she built over years, was now another casualty of her choices. She signed the resignation letter with trembling hands, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly. Meanwhile, her husband found unexpected strength through his VA support group. His story of betrayal struck a chord with other veterans who had experienced similar pain. They rallied around him, offering not just emotional support but practical help too. One veteran's wife, a nurse, offered to help coordinate his medical care. Another veteran, who owned a small construction company, modified his apartment to make it more wheelchair accessible, refusing any payment. The military community's response was a stark contrast to how they treated her. Veterans' wives who had once been her closest friends now blocked her on social media. The support group she'd helped organize for military spouses asked her to step down from her leadership role. Each rejection was a reminder of not just what she'd lost, but what she'd thrown away. Her attempts to explain herself to mutual friends fell on deaf ears. "He was injured serving our country," one friend said bluntly. "He needed you, and you chose yourself." The harsh words echoed what she already knew. There was no justifying what she'd done. The narrative was simple in everyone's eyes. She had betrayed not just her husband, but an American hero. The financial consequences hit hard too. Without her teaching job, she struggled to make ends meet at her sister's house. The joint accounts were frozen pending legal proceedings. The comfortable life they'd built together crumbled like a house of cards. She found herself applying for retail jobs, her master's degree and years of teaching experience suddenly seeming worthless. Her husband, despite his injury, showed remarkable resilience. He channeled his pain into physical therapy, pushing himself harder than ever. The other veterans noticed his determination and started including him in their adaptive sports programs. Soon he was learning wheelchair basketball, finding a new kind of freedom in the sport. The contrast between their new lives became stark. While she was being shunned at the grocery store, he was being celebrated at VA events. While she struggled to find work, he was discovering new purposes and possibilities. His injury, which had once seemed like the end of his dreams, became the beginning of a new chapter. She, on the other hand, watched her carefully built life dissolve like sugar in rain. The PE teacher's cowardly disappearance added another layer of pain. She'd risked everything for someone who, in the end, wouldn't even stand by her. Seeing him erase their relationship so easily made her question everything. Had any of it been real, or had she destroyed her marriage for an illusion? Some nights, she'd drive by their old apartment, seeing the lights on and wondering about her husband's new life. She'd think about their routine. Was someone else helping him with his exercises now? Who made sure his medications were arranged properly? The guilt of abandoning her duties as a caregiver added to her shame. The divorce proceedings loomed like a storm cloud. Her lawyer, a stern woman with tired eyes, advised her to seek therapy. "This isn't just about the legal separation," she said. "You need to understand why you made these choices." The suggestion felt like both a lifeline and an accusation. The revelation spread like wildfire through their small military community. His phone started buzzing with messages from concerned friends and fellow veterans. Her phone, still on the counter between them, lit up with panicked texts from the PE teacher, wondering why she wasn't responding to his messages. As the day wore on, the initial shock gave way to a deeper, more complicated pain. He watched her trying to explain, to minimize, to rationalize, but all he could see was the stranger she'd become. The woman who had been his rock through injury and recovery was now the source of his deepest wound. Their apartment, once a sanctuary of healing and hope, felt tainted. Every surface held memories of lies. The couch where she'd sat texting her lover, the dining table where she'd planned her deceptions, the bedroom where she'd dreamt of another man. The medical equipment that filled their space, once symbols of his progress, now felt like monuments to her betrayal. The sun was setting when she finally stopped talking, her voice hoarse from explaining, defending, apologizing. He hadn't moved from his spot by the kitchen counter, his military training helping him maintain composure even as his world crumbled around him. The final light of day cast long shadows across their apartment, matching the darkness that had settled over their marriage. "I think you should stay with your sister tonight," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of command he'd learned in the military. She nodded, defeated, and began gathering some clothes. As she packed, he sat in silence, wondering how they would tell their families, their friends, their community. How do you announce that the woman everyone had praised for her dedication and sacrifice had been living a double life? Before she left, she turned back one last time, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, but sorry couldn't erase the messages he'd read. Sorry couldn't undo the nights she'd spent in another man's arms. Sorry couldn't rebuild the trust that had been shattered like glass on their kitchen floor. The truth has a way of surfacing, like a bubble rising through water, impossible to stop once it starts moving. On a quiet Sunday morning, while his wife was in the shower, the husband's world shattered with a single notification that lit up her forgotten phone on the kitchen counter. The message preview was brief but devastating. "Miss you already. Last night was amazing." His hands trembled as he picked up the phone, his military training kicking in as he fought to stay calm. Each swipe revealed more messages, more lies, more betrayal. The conversations went back months, sweet nothings, meeting arrangements, photos that made his stomach turn. He sat there in his wheelchair, paralyzed in a different way now, reading through 3 months of deception. The sound of the shower running became white noise as he discovered detailed plans of their meetings, excuses she used, and moments stolen while he was at physical therapy. His military mind, trained to analyze and assess situations, now worked against him as he pieced together all the signs he'd missed. The shower stopped. He could hear her humming, a habit she recently started again. Had that been because of him? The bathroom door opened and steam rolled out into the hallway. He waited, still holding her phone, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. She walked into the kitchen wearing her favorite weekend sweater, hair wrapped in a towel. The moment she saw him with her phone, all the color drained from her face. The hum died in her throat. Time seemed to freeze as their eyes met across the room. How long? His voice was steady, surprising even himself. She started with denial, a reflex as natural as breathing. I don't know what you're talking about. But her trembling hands betrayed her. When he started reading the messages out loud, her defenses crumbled like a sandcastle hit by a wave. The next hour was a blur of tears, accusations, and confessions. She paced the kitchen, alternating between apologizing and trying to justify her actions. He remained eerily still in his wheelchair, his military training evident in his controlled responses, though his knuckles were white from gripping the armrests. I was lonely, she cried, her words echoing off the kitchen tiles. You were so focused on your recovery. I was focused on getting better for us, he cut her off, his voice carrying the weight of betrayal. While I was fighting to walk again, you were... He couldn't finish the sentence. The reality was too painful to voice. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the ghost of their former happiness. Details spilled out like water from a broken dam. The PE teacher, the stolen afternoons, the lies about support group meetings and errands. Each revelation was like a knife twisting deeper into his heart. The worst part wasn't even the physical betrayal, it was the elaborate web of deception she'd woven while he trusted her completely. His military brothers had always talked about battlefield trauma, but nothing had prepared him for this kind of pain. This was a different sort of injury, one that no amount of physical therapy could heal. As she talked, he found himself remembering all the times she kissed him goodbye, knowing she was going to meet another man. All the times she'd held his hand during therapy sessions, a phone buzzing with messages from her lover. The neighbors must have heard their voices rising and falling through the thin apartment walls. Her crying, his controlled but pained responses, the sound of her keys hitting the counter when he asked her to leave. The same neighbors who had brought them meals after his injury, who had watched her push his wheelchair during his early recovery days, now became unwitting witnesses to their marriage unraveling. Memories flooded his mind as they argued, their wedding day, when she'd promised to stand by him through everything. The day of his injury, when she'd flown across the country to be by his hospital bed. All those nights she'd helped him through the pain and frustration of rehabilitation. How had they gone from that to this? Her husband, despite his physical limitations, remained perceptive. He noticed how she no longer shared stories about her day, how she seemed to rush through their evening routine. Sometimes he'd catch her staring into space with a look he couldn't quite read. When he asked about her day, her answers became vague and rehearsed. The PE teacher grew bolder in his pursuit. He'd send messages while she was at home, knowing she was with her husband. He'd suggest meeting places that were increasingly risky. The danger of discovery added an element of excitement that she hated herself for enjoying. Their school colleagues began to notice too. The whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the teacher's lounge, the knowing looks when she and the PE teacher arrived at meetings at the same time. She told herself she didn't care what they thought, but deep down, the shame was eating her alive. One evening, she came home later than usual, her hair slightly disheveled and wearing the same clothes she'd left in that morning. Her husband was sitting in his wheelchair by the window, something he did when he couldn't sleep. The look in his eyes told her he knew something was wrong, but he didn't ask. His silence was worse than any accusation. That night, as she lay awake listening to her husband's breathing, she realized how far she'd strayed from the woman who had once promised to love him in sickness and in health. The excitement of her affair had begun to fade, replaced by a hollow feeling that no amount of stolen moments could fill. But breaking free from the affair felt impossible. The PE teacher had become her addiction, her escape from the reality of her life. Even as she recognized the destruction she was causing, she couldn't seem to stop herself from responding to his messages, from finding excuses to see him, from living this double life that was slowly destroying everything she had once held dear. Winter brought shorter days and longer shadows, both outside and within their marriage. What started as innocent coffee meetings had grown into something that could no longer be ignored. The line between friendship and something more had blurred beyond recognition, like footprints in freshly fallen snow. It began with small changes. She started wearing perfume again, something she'd stopped doing months ago. She spent more time choosing her outfits, even for simple errands. Her phone became her constant companion, always kept face down when she was home. Each notification made her heart race, a mixture of excitement and guilt washing over her. The PE teacher had become her escape from reality. Their conversations moved from school matters to personal dreams and desires. He would tell her about his travels, his hopes of starting his own fitness center someday. She found herself sharing her own buried dreams. The master's degree she'd put on hold, the countries she'd wanted to visit, the life she'd imagined before everything changed. Their first physical contact was supple, a lingering touch while reaching for the same door handle, a comforting hug that lasted a few seconds too long. Each small moment of connection sent electric shocks through her system, reminding her of feelings she thought she'd forgotten. The guilt that followed was overwhelming, but not enough to make her stop. At home, her husband noticed the changes but couldn't quite piece them together. He saw how she checked her phone more frequently, how she seemed distracted during their evening conversations. When he asked if everything was okay, she'd brush it off, saying she was just tired or stressed about managing his care. The lies came easier each time, like stepping stones leading her further away from their marriage. The first kiss happened after a particularly emotional day. Her husband had a difficult therapy session, and instead of staying with him, she made an excuse about needing to run errands. She found herself in the school parking lot, crying in her car. The PE teacher saw her and came to check if she was okay. One moment they were talking, the next moment everything changed. The kiss was brief, but it shattered whatever remained of her moral boundaries. After that day, their meetings became more frequent and deliberate. They'd meet during his free periods or after school, always with carefully crafted excuses about committee meetings or errands. She coordinated these meetings around her husband's therapy sessions and nurse visits, becoming an expert at managing time in a way that made her sick to her stomach when she thought about it. The physical affair began 3 months after that first kiss. They met at his apartment just to talk, she told herself, but they both knew it was more than that. Afterward, she sat in her car for an hour, crying so hard she could barely breathe. The weight of her betrayal felt like it would crush her, but instead of stopping, she found ways to justify it. She told herself she deserved happiness, that she needed this escape to be a better caregiver. She convinced herself that her husband was too focused on his recovery to notice her emotional absence. Each lie she told herself made the next one easier to believe. Back home, she became an actress in her own life. She'd kiss her husband goodnight while thinking about another man. She'd listen to him talk about his progress in physical therapy while planning her next secret meeting. The guilt was constant, but so was the thrill of her double life. The changing seasons marked subtle shifts in their relationship. What started as group lunches became one-on-one coffee meetings. Brief texts evolved into long conversations about hopes, dreams, and regrets. She found herself putting extra effort into her appearance before seeing him, something she hadn't done in months. At home, she began noticing every frustration more acutely, the constant medical equipment cluttering their space, the endless appointments, the way her husband's depression affected every aspect of their lives. She caught herself daydreaming about a simpler life, one without the weight of caregiving and responsibility. The guilt was eating her alive, but so was the loneliness. She loved her husband deeply, but she missed the emotional connection they once shared. The PE teacher offered something different, not better, but easier. He represented a world without complications, without medical equipment, without the constant worry that had become her daily companion. Their friendship teetered on the edge of something more, like a car slowly drifting toward the center line on a dark road. She knew she should pull back, set boundaries, focus on her marriage. But the allure of feeling understood, of feeling like more than just a caregiver, was powerful. She found herself looking forward to their meetings with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. As autumn turned to winter, she stood at a crossroads. Each text message, each lingering conversation, each shared secret was a step away from her marriage vows. The temptation wasn't about attraction, it was about escape, about feeling normal again, about being seen as a woman rather than just a caregiver. But deep down, she knew that every step toward this new connection was a step away from the man who had given everything for his country and who now needed her more than ever. 6 months into their new life, the routine of rehabilitation and caregiving had become all-consuming. The school principal had been understanding, holding her teaching position but suggesting she take an extended leave to focus on her husband's recovery. At first, she was grateful for the time, but slowly, the walls of their apartment began to feel like they were closing in. Her world had shrunk to a schedule of doctor's appointments, therapy sessions, and medication times. The vibrant woman who once organized community events and ran marathons now spent her days measuring progress in tiny increments, celebrating when her husband could dress himself or sit up for longer periods. The change wasn't just physical, it was reshaping her entire identity. One morning, after a particularly rough night where her husband's pain had kept them both awake, she decided to visit her old classroom to pick up some personal items. The familiar smell of crayons and chalk brought tears to her eyes. Her colleague from the next classroom noticed her crying in the hallway and invited her for coffee in the teacher's lounge. That simple cup of coffee became a lifeline. For the first time in months, someone asked her how she was doing, not how her husband was doing, not how the rehabilitation was going, but how she was holding up. The conversation flowed easily, touching on school gossip, funny student stories, and life beyond medical challenges. It felt like coming up for air after being underwater for too long. Her colleague introduced her to a group of teachers who met regularly for lunch. Among them was the new physical education teacher who had recently transferred from another district. He was easy to talk to, with a warm smile and a gift for making people laugh. During these lunches, she found herself remembering what it felt like to just be herself, not someone's caregiver or support system. The lunches became a regular escape. She justified them as necessary breaks for her mental health, always making sure her husband's nurse was there before she left. During these brief outings, she could pretend her life was normal again. The PE teacher seemed to understand her situation perfectly, having watched his own mother care for his father during a long illness. He knew exactly what to say when she was having a hard day. Their friendly conversations gradually moved to text messages, nothing inappropriate at first, just checking in or sharing funny memes. But soon, she found herself reaching for her phone more often, looking forward to his messages, feeling a flutter of excitement when his name appeared on her screen. She told herself it was innocent, just a friendship that helped her cope with her challenging situation. The guilt started creeping in during quiet moments. When her husband would thank her for everything she did for him, her heart would clench, knowing she was developing feelings for someone else. She began comparing her present life with what could have been. A dangerous game that only led down darker paths. The PE teacher never pushed any boundaries, but he was always there, offering a sympathetic ear and understanding smile. When she mentioned struggling with moving her husband's wheelchair up their apartment's small entrance ramp, he offered to help install a better one over the weekend. When she talked about missing teaching, he invited her to guest speak in his health classes about caregiving and resilience. Their conversations grew deeper and more personal. She found herself sharing fears she couldn't voice to anyone else, her worries about the future, her feelings of being trapped, her grief for the life they'd planned together. He listened without judgment, offering gentle support and understanding that made her feel less alone. One evening, after a particularly difficult therapy session where her husband had struggled with depression, she texted the PE teacher instead of calling her usual support group. They ended up talking for hours, and for the first time, she admitted out loud that she sometimes wondered if she could handle this life forever. His response was caring and supportive, but it crossed an emotional line they'd been carefully avoiding. The VA support groups became their lifeline. Meeting other couples going through similar situations helped them feel less alone. They found strength in sharing their struggles and strategies with others who truly understood. He particularly connected with a group of younger veterans who were finding ways to stay active despite their injuries, introducing him to adaptive sports and showing him that life could still be full of purpose and achievement. As months passed, they settled into new routines. Physical therapy became less intensive but remained a constant part of their lives. They learned to celebrate different kinds of progress. The first time he could transfer himself from bed to wheelchair without help, the day he managed to cook breakfast for her while she slept in, the moment he felt strong enough to mentor other newly injured veterans. But beneath the surface of their adapting life, subtle changes were taking root. The long hours of caregiving began to blur the lines between wife and nurse. The emotional toll of constant worry and responsibility started to wear on her spirit. And though neither would admit it yet, their relationship was shifting in ways that would soon test the very foundation of their marriage. The fourth deployment started like any other. There were the usual tearful goodbyes at the airport, the tight hugs that never seemed long enough, and promises to stay in touch. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the way he lingered a little longer before going through security, or how she couldn't stop taking pictures of them together in the terminal. Looking back, perhaps they both had a sense that this deployment would change their lives forever. The first few months followed their familiar routine. They'd video call whenever possible, sharing pieces of their days despite the time difference. She'd tell him about her students' achievements and the care packages she was organizing with other military spouses. He'd share funny stories about his unit brothers and describe the beautiful desert sunsets. They'd end each call the same way, with their special gesture, hands forming a heart shape against their screens. Then came that Tuesday morning. She was teaching her class when she noticed two military officers walking down the school hallway. Her heart stopped for a moment, knowing what their presence could mean. But they weren't there to deliver the worst news. Instead, they informed her that her husband had been seriously injured in an IED explosion during a routine patrol. The next 48 hours were a blur of flights, military hospitals, and medical terms she'd never heard before. When she finally saw him in the hospital in Germany, she had to steady herself against the doorframe. The strong, vibrant man who'd left just months ago was lying still, connected to various machines. The doctors explained that the explosion had caused severe spinal trauma, resulting in partial paralysis from the waist down. Those first weeks in the hospital tested everything they thought they knew about love and commitment. She learned to help with basic care, watching nurses demonstrate how to prevent bed sores and assist with exercises. He struggled with accepting help for even the simplest tasks, fighting both physical pain and the emotional challenge of dependency. But through it all, they found moments of light, celebrating small victories like his first time sitting up unassisted, or laughing together when she accidentally walked into his room wearing mismatched shoes after a sleepless night. The medical evacuation back to the States brought new challenges. Hours of physical therapy turned into a full-time job for both of them. She took leave from teaching, determined to be there for every appointment, every setback, and every triumph. The military community rallied around them, bringing meals, offering rides, and helping to modify their home for wheelchair accessibility. But beyond the physical challenges, they faced an emotional mountain. He struggled with his new identity, grappling with the loss of the career he loved and the independence he'd always taken for granted. Some nights, she'd find him sitting in his wheelchair by the window, staring at old photos from his deployment days. She learned to read his silences, knowing when to offer comfort and when to give him space to process his emotions. Their relationship dynamics shifted in ways they never expected. Simple activities like grocery shopping or going to the movies now required careful planning. Date nights changed from spontaneous adventures to carefully orchestrated outings that had to account for wheelchair accessibility. But they worked to find joy in their new normal, discovering new hobbies they could share and adapting old ones to fit their changed circumstances. The hardest part wasn't the physical challenges, it was watching him battle depression. The man who once led troops into combat now struggled with feeling helpless in their own home. He'd put on a brave face during therapy sessions, but she could see the pain in his eyes when he watched other couples taking walks in the park or when his old unit deployed without him. She threw herself into being his support system, sometimes at the expense of her own well-being. Their small apartment became filled with medical equipment, appointment calendars, and rehabilitation schedules. She coordinated with doctors, therapists, and VA representatives, advocating fiercely for the best care possible. But in the quiet moments when she thought he was sleeping, she'd sometimes let her own tears fall, feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility and missing the carefree days of their early marriage. Their friends and family tried to help, but few could truly understand what they were going through. Well-meaning visitors would sometimes say the wrong things, offering shallow platitudes about everything happening for a reason or suggesting miracle cures they'd read about online. She became protective of their space and their story, carefully filtering the advice and support they accepted. Life wasn't perfect. Military marriages never are. But they faced each challenge together. When he had to leave for training exercises, they'd write letters even though they had phones. When she struggled with loneliness during his absences, she threw herself into the military spouse community, organizing support events and making lifelong friends. Their love grew stronger through the challenges. Each reunion was sweeter than the last, each goodbye a little harder but strengthened by their commitment to each other. They weren't just building a marriage. They were building a foundation of trust, understanding, and unwavering support that would be tested in ways they never imagined. As his third year of service approached, they were starting to talk about their future plans, maybe starting a family after his next deployment, buying a house off base, and building roots in the community they'd grown to love. They were young, in love, and believed they could face anything life threw at them. Little did they know, their strength would soon be tested in ways they never imagined, and their love story would take turns that would challenge everything they thought they knew about commitment, sacrifice, and redemption. The sun was setting over the military base in Georgia when two people's lives changed forever. It was 2018, and the warm southern breeze carried the sound of distant helicopters and the chatter of soldiers going about their evening routines. A young Army sergeant, tall and proud in his uniform, was video calling his family back home when a notification popped up on his phone. Someone had liked his comment on a military support group post. That's how their story began, not with fireworks or dramatic declarations of love, but with a simple heart emoji on social media. She was a volunteer at a veterans organization, passionate about supporting military families. He was serving his second deployment, dedicated to his country and his unit. Their first conversation started with a simple "thank you for your service" message, but something about her genuine interest in understanding military life caught his attention. Their early messages were casual. She'd ask about his day, and he'd share what he could about life on base. She'd tell him about her work at a local elementary school, teaching third graders who were fascinated by her stories about helping military families. They discovered they both loved old soul music, could spend hours watching cooking shows, and shared the same goofy sense of humor about bad dad jokes. As weeks turned into months, their conversations grew deeper. Late at night, when the desert wind howled outside his barracks, they'd talk about their hopes and fears. She confessed her worry about committing to military life, having seen friends struggle with deployments and constant moves. He opened up about his family's initial doubts about his enlistment, being the first in his family to join the military. Their relationship bloomed through screens and letters. She'd send him care packages filled with his favorite snacks and handwritten notes that made him smile even on the toughest days. He'd find creative ways to surprise her, once getting his whole unit to help create a birthday video that left her in happy tears. When he came home on leave, they finally met in person at a small coffee shop near the base. She was nervously fixing her hair when he walked in, and he almost tripped over a chair because he was so focused on finding her face in the crowd. Their friends later joked that everyone in the coffee shop could feel the electricity when they first hugged. Their courtship was a whirlwind of weekend visits, long drives between states, and planning their future between his training schedules. She started learning everything she could about military life, joining support groups, and making friends with other military partners. He found himself imagining a future beyond his next deployment, a home, a family, a life with someone who truly understood and supported his calling. The proposal wasn't elaborate or perfectly planned. It happened during one of their weekend visits, after they'd spent the day helping at a veterans fundraiser. They were sitting on the hood of his truck, watching the stars, when he turned to her and simply said, "I can't imagine doing life without you." She looked at him, tears already forming in her eyes, knowing what was coming next. The ring was his grandmother's, simple and elegant, just like their love story. Their wedding was a beautiful blend of military tradition and personal touches. His unit brothers stood proud in their dress uniforms, while her students made a surprise appearance to sing their favorite song. The ceremony was small but filled with love, both families coming together to celebrate not just their union, but the commitment they were both making to a life of service. The early days of their marriage were an adventure in learning and adjusting. She had to adapt to military life, the strict schedules, the acronyms that seemed like a foreign language, and the unique culture of base living. He learned to balance his duties with being a husband, always making sure to find small ways to show her she was his priority even when duty called. They made their first home on base housing, turning the standard-issue quarters into a cozy nest with photos, plants, and touches of both their personalities. Friday movie nights became their tradition, along with Sunday morning pancake competitions where they'd try to outdo each other with creative toppings and shapes.